One quick announcement is that 1840 is finally moving into some actual live events, and we have our first 1840 live event on February 23rd in the Upper West Side at Stand Up New York, where I will be in conversation with the amazing comedian, always a favorite, Modi. It's going to be a serious conversation about comedy. Again, that's February 23rd. It begins at 7 p.m. Doors open. The formal show will start at 8. General admission is $25, VIP $39. You can find out more at 1840.org/Modi, M-O-D-I. We really hope to see you there. Hello, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're exploring the state of Jewish education. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas, so be sure to check out 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. This series was sponsored by Ari and Daniela Schwartz in memory of Mr. Baruch Mappa, Baruch ben Asher Zelig Halevi, an incredible individual, one of the few survivors of the Lutz ghetto in Poland, together with his wife, established a beautiful, prosperous Frum family here in America. A while back in 1840, listeners suggested a potential guest, and it was a fabulous suggestion. It was a guest who lived, I believe, in Lakewood, New Jersey, and said that he read a book by Professor Jack Wertheimer called The New American Judaism. And he recommended it. I think I read it on the air, and I said, I hadn't read it, but I really did want to invite him on. And this past Shabbos, if those of you may know or, may peek at my Twitter account, no worries if you don't, of course. But I try to read a book. I say every Shabbos. Lord knows I don't actually finish a book every Shabbos, much to the haters' chagrin. People call, there's no way you finish that over Shabbos. No, I don't actually finish it every Shabbos, but I try over the course of the week to finish a book. I don't finish it all the time, but this past Shabbos, a different 1840 listener, my dear friend Mark Trencher, who we've had on, a former 1840 guest, does amazing research and data and statistics in the Jewish community, actually sent me a copy of the book to read over Shabbos, which is exactly what I read. I'll be honest, there was no mind-blowing insights to the book. Jack Wertheimer, who I believe is a sociologist at JTS, the conservative seminary, to me, what it really confirmed was just the ability to analyze the Jewish community from a place of neutrality. I think, God willing, we'll talk about this when we discuss denominations, but it's hard to weigh in when you are entrenched or positioned within the Orthodox community. I always have a hesitant to weigh in on any other community other than my own. I don't feel appropriate. I don't feel that that's particularly my place, though I do hope we're going to do a series on it relatively soon, because I feel like our very conception of how this model of Judaism, this tripartite denominations have broken down, is becoming increasingly relevant and increasingly misunderstood. But there's one thing that jumped out at me in the book, and that is where he discusses what really sets Orthodox Jews apart. And I don't believe that he is Orthodox himself, which I think gives it a great deal of credibility. It's why the first person who recommended the book to me, this listener in Lakewood, said there's something very inspiring, and I did find it quite inspiring, of what, so to speak, the Orthodox community has built in America. And he says it very plainly, and I want to read what he writes over here. But engaging in prescribed religious practices is not the only trait that sets Orthodox Jews apart. In the aggregate, they're also far more knowledgeable about the minutiae of Jewish practice and the basics of their religion. For a good many non-Orthodox Jews, Judaism is shrouded in mystery. It is a foreign way of behaving and being. The great advantage Orthodox Jews have over most of their non-Orthodox counterparts is their relatively high level of Judaic literacy. Rather than rely upon osmosis, imitation, or some vague form of familial transition, Orthodox Jews have invested heavily to ensure their members acquire the skills and knowledge to live out their religious lives. The Jewish day school movement is overwhelmingly an Orthodox phenomenon, and its educational mission is reinforced by summer camps, youth groups, and other informal educational vehicles, and eventually by gap year study in Israel. To be sure, not every Orthodox Jew is a learned Talmud scholar, and he's absolutely right, probably myself included. But the vast majority of Orthodox males have been exposed to the study of Judaism's major religious texts, such as the Hebrew Bible, Talmud, and codes of law, law. And though females are given a different type of Jewish education in some sectors of the Orthodox community, they too are exposed. And I read this and I captured this and shared it on this thread where I kind of picked out highlights of the book. I wrote, "The secret of the success of the Orthodox community is not such a secret. Education, 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 education." And that we've built this has not been always an easy battle. And the battle, God forbid, is not with the non-Orthodox movement. The battle began, I think, with parents and being able to plead your case with parents of why this is necessary. Those are my own grandparents, my father's parents, my mother's parents, as I mentioned, were the ones who set up the Talmud Torah in Portland, Maine. But even making this case was very, very difficult. They said, who could have guessed that this would be the linchpin that really transformed the narrative of Judaism, particularly in the United States? And I think by and large, what we have built is absolutely extraordinary. But unfortunately, I believe by and large, we've begun to take it for granted, what we've built. The battles to build, to fund, to create the day school movement that I believe in many ways has been the source of vitality for all American Jews, because I think the graduates of these schools affect all of American Jewry. It's not just the Orthodox community. All boats are lifted with the tide of what Jewish education has done to transform American Jewry. But increasingly now, we take it for granted, and increasingly in conversations, Jewish education goes hand in hand with the frustrations, the very real, and I think the word frustration is too small, the suffering of families who it is very difficult to pay for this. It becomes nearly impossible to afford your kid a Jewish education if this is in fact the secret sauce of what keeps our community literate, educated, involved in Jewish life. Then it needs to be for everybody. And that's why I thought it was so important to really do a deep dive to help people understand kind of the back end of why is this so complicated, particularly in the United States. Why can't the government just fund our schools? And kind of a short answer is well, separation of church and state. It's actually quite complicated in how this has changed at both the federal level and the state level. And I believe if education is the source of our Jewish engagement, then our engagement with the project of Jewish education itself is also going to be a product of our education about this issue. We need to understand what are the barriers, what are the difficulties, what are the fights that are going on. And there is nobody on planet Earth that I find is a better explainer of some of the legal mysteries, the fights, the battles that have shaped the current landscape of the advocacy that is done on behalf of Jewish education. And that is my dearest friend, and I really do say this, he's a mentor, Professor Michael Avi Helfand. He is really more than a professor to me. He sat on my dissertation committee. So I think there's a fancy word for this, an Uber doctor. He is the person who kind of, among a panel of others, gave me that stamp. I don't use my, rabbi doctor card really often at all. Somebody could do a study of children of medical doctors. How confident are they using the title doctor when they introduce themselves? I am not confident at all, but I am glad that it is done, and I never would have finished without Avi's guidance, help, and direction. And he's become really one of my closest friends who we discuss these primary issues. And what I call him always is he is the educator-in-chief of the Jewish community when it comes to legal battles that involve religious liberty, religious freedom. One of the things that I admire most about him is he is really one of the most avowed centrists I have ever met. He really just calls balls and strikes in the community. And reading his op-eds, whether they're in the Wall Street Journal or in First Things, where he writes about some of the most contentious battles in the Jewish community, but in such a level-headed balls and strikes with a substantive legal analysis. I always look forward for the way that he breaks down issues. And that's exactly what I had him do on the issue of Jewish education in the United States. So if legal matters don't interest you, this episode is going to be an absolute doozy. But if you want more informed conversations about what is the landscape, what can we do, and why are we here in this current battle, so to speak, for Jewish day schools, there is nobody better than Professor Avi Helfand. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our conversation with Professor Avi Helfand. I don't even know the origin story of how we know each other, but we know each other quite well. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce, and I really mean this, one of my dearest friends, Dr. Avi Michael Helfand.
So first of all, it's Michael Avi Helfand, Michal Avigdor. So we don't know each other that well, David, and I'm a little bit upset right now.
That's not true. That's not true. I want to say off the bat, we do go a ways back. The first time I met you, I called you Michael, I think throughout the entire conversation until the very end. You said you could really call me Avi.
Well, I only let my friends call me Avi, and I was sizing you up.
And at the end, I guess I won. I won that.
Yeah.
I passed the test. I really owe a great deal of gratitude to you for two reasons. The more simple reason is you sat on my dissertation committee.
Well, that was a pleasure for me. What do you mean?
I don't think ever sitting on a dissertation committee is a pleasure, but we worked a great deal with one another. But number two, I think more than anyone else, somebody who has a lens to my maybe like intellectual / professional anxiety. You have that window. Like, I feel like so many of our conversations begin and end with like, how you doing? How you holding up there, buddy?
Well, you're looking great this evening, first of all. And
I know you don't mean that, because I know how I look this evening.
And second of all, in all fairness, most of the time when I'm calling you, it's like, oh, am I doing this right? Like I'm about to write something or do something, and like, it's not quite right. You remember like that Rabbi Lamb article that I wrote for Tablet?
I absolutely do.
And there was something wrong with it, and I couldn't figure it out, and you looked at it for 3 seconds, and you're like, that last paragraph is junk. If you pull it out, it's going to be great. And I think it was.
I appreciate it. And I'm having here, to have a conversation over a topic that I don't think is anxiety inducing, something that you are deeply involved in, both in your position as a legal scholar, somebody who's done work. You're now the associate dean at, did I mess this up already?
Yeah, you did. Don't worry about that. I was associate dean and vice dean at Pepperdine Caruso School of Law. I stepped down on August 1 because administration of law schools is
not so fun.
No, who wants to do that? Not me.
You've been a guest lecturer at Yale Law School?
I'm a visiting professor at Yale Law School.
Visiting professor.
And Oscar M. Rubhausen Distinguished Fellow for throwing around titles.
And why not?
Why not?
Once we're here. But more than anything else, you have done a lot of actual work in cases involving educational funding from the government for Jewish schools, and really have become deeply enmeshed in that issue. And I guess I wanted to start this conversation with painting the scene at a Shabbos table, Shabbos afternoon. People are sitting around. Conversation invariably begins to turn to the tuition crisis. People are paying so much money for schooling. And you hear a number of, different plans for how we're going to solve this. But one person says, why don't we just get the government to pay for our secular education? Why don't we get them to pay for our math teachers, for our biology teachers, for all of that? And somebody else will say, well, I'm just going to take the whole thing as a tax write-off and see what the government can do about it. There seems to be the great hope of the Jewish community is that the government could step in and begin to fund Jewish education. It is extremely costly for families. I believe it is actually reshaping the landscape of what it means to be affiliated Jewishly, to provide your kids with a Jewish education. And I wanted to begin with, where does the story begin of government funding for schools, and why has this not been successful in the past, and has anything changed since then?
Yeah, you can start the story in a lot of places. I'm going to do my best to do it chronologically.
Okay.
I'd say, much of the story starts in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, you had public schools which were heavily influenced and dominated by American Protestantism. They were considered like an institution cut from the cloth of American Protestantism. And, during that time period in the 19th century, what you had was a deep skepticism of various religious minorities, in particular Catholics. And so first it was a fellow named James Blaine tried to make it happen on the federal level in Congress to have something now called the Blaine Amendment, where they prohibited funds from going to religious schools, any funding from going to religious schools. And that didn't work as a federal law. He didn't get enough votes.
Oh, he tried to pass as a law on the federal level.
Tried to get legislation.
Didn't happen. And he was actively trying to discriminate against Catholics.
The history is pretty strong on this.
Okay.
There's a lot to talk about here. There's some people who wonder a little bit about the history, but I think what I'm describing to you is conventional history.
Okay.
Sufficiently conventional that it's been mentioned in Supreme Court cases.
Okay.
So when the federal government couldn't enact this law, they didn't have the votes. So a lot of states did it. They call them mini Blaine main amendments. And, for over half the states around the country, they actually have laws on the books that say different versions of it. No money to religious schools, no money to religious institutions, no money directly or indirectly to religious institutions. And that's like the 19th century story that really lurks in the background of everything we're going to talk about. Let's leave that aside. I'll come back to that later, but it's important in terms of the chronology of it all. In the 20th century, what you have is really the rise of the Establishment Clause, the principle in the First Amendment that there needs to be some degree of separation between church and state.
That is written in our Constitution.
Yeah. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, that's the Establishment Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the Free Exercise Clause, the one that gives us religious liberty. So like the first 16 words of the First Amendment have those two principles. On the one hand, separation of church and state. On the other hand, the requirement of some degree of religious liberty.
That you can be able to practice the religion of your choice.
Yeah, so that's the big question. Does it mean practice or not? In the late 19th century, they thought, no, it just means believing things. There's a long history there, and I look forward to our next podcast
where we'll get
where we
really
talk about
the
that.
deep dive.
I know you want to hear about Employment Division v. Smith, so we'll get to that next time. But on the separation of church and state side, so in the 20th century, this is where you really start having a lot of cases trying to figure out what does it mean to have church and state be separate. In fact, a lot of this litigation is pressed by the American Jewish community, deeply concerned that if there weren't some degree of separation between church and state, it would be a problem for religious minorities. Think like prayer in public schools, when you have lots of Jewish kids going to public school, and the idea that they would be forced, coerced, subjected to a requirement or an inducement to pray to a God that isn't theirs. You can see why, as an American Jew, the principle of separation of church and state in some areas was really important.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's so obvious to us now that we should not have prayer in public schools. It happens to be both of my parents grew up saying, I believe the Lord's Prayer in public school. But when that case came out, a lot of the briefs that were submitted to the court from Jewish organizations actually supported the continuation of prayer in public school.
Well, so this is itself a divide. I'd say the main arms of American Judaism, we usually talk in terms of the big three. The American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, and the Anti-Defamation League pressed hard, both in terms of funding some litigation and in supporting in other ways through amicus briefs, third-party briefs.
An amicus brief, what an interesting term. What does that mean?
Amicus brief means friend of the court. So normally litigation is between A and B, and sometimes C is just sitting around and he's seeing what's going on, I guess. Get it at C?
Oh, cute.
Huh? There you go. It's really late, everyone. So C is watching what's going on, and C says, I want to file a brief because the stakes of the litigation between A and B really impact me in an important and unique way, and I have some stuff I want to tell the court. So it knows about it when it decides this case. Amicus briefs.
That's singular.
Amicus briefs, yeah. You can have amici. That's like lots of different people signing an amicus brief.
I'm going to let you know two things. Number one, you're the person who taught me the correct pronunciation of amici.
What'd you think it was beforehand?
Amici? I'm nearly sure I thought it was amici, but number two, I find it to be the most adorable Latin word that I know.
How many Latin words do you know?
I know like maybe 10, like maybe just less than the amount of Yiddish I know, but amici to me sounds like a very cute name for like a pet name. Amici, like a lawyer should name like a little, like, I don't know, like a pet monkey or something very cute, like a ferret.
I don't think this is going to resonate with anybody.
No,
like
but
your listeners right now are thinking, oh boy, what's wrong with this guy?
No. They know me by now. So people were submitting, and the original battle, and this is where are we now? In the 1960s?
Yeah, 50s, 60s. Yeah.
Was over prayer in public school.
Yeah, and I think that's the one that's easiest for people to understand. Like, you can see the challenge, especially for American Jews, and why American Jews were so sensitive to this issue. When it came originally to church and state, questions of church and state, no faith community in the 50s and 60s and 70s filed more of these amicus briefs in church-state questions than American Jews. And we're a minority. I mean, there are not a ton of us. Mm-hmm. You would think, right, that somebody else would carry the mantle of like most amicus briefs. But it was American Jews who were really pushing this and pushing this hard in ways that were complicated, that made people think we were secularists, that we were aligned with the communists. I mean, this was a complicated time to be pushing these issues. And that was core to American Judaism, its identity and its commitments. You know, the challenge is with like separation of church and state, it's a fuzzy principle. So like you might be able to see it and see why it makes sense to you when it comes to questions of like prayer in public school, but it also then filtered into questions of government funding of religion. And when you get to the 60s and then the 70s, the Supreme Court starts to render multiple decisions, pushing back on the idea that government is allowed to fund religious institutions.
Where was the first battleground for this?
I would probably say, I don't know, first, it's most associated with a decision called Lemon v. Kurtzman. People often talk about the lemon test, if you've heard that. The lemon test.
Believe it. What was that case about?
There was a question of whether or not you could provide funding to religious schools for general studies teachers, let's say. So actually, off the top of my head, don't remember what subject they were teaching. I think it was Pennsylvania and Rhode Island. If I'm wrong about the states, if you could ask my sister-in-law, Dina, who edits this podcast.
That was going to be a reveal at the very end.
Oh, how could we not talk about
There's a bit
Dina?
of nepotism involved that the editor of this podcast is your sister-in-law.
That's why it took you 3 years to invite me. So there you had general studies teachers, and the Supreme Court said you can't provide government funding to offset some of the costs of these general studies teachers.
Because that would violate
Separation of church and state, exactly.
specifically the Establishment Clause.
Yeah, and Establishment Clause and this concept, this principle that the Establishment Clause represents of separation of church and state.
And they came up with this principle of how do we evaluate when is it okay and not okay to provide funding, and that's the lemon test. What exactly is that test?
Well, let's focus on one prong of it. I think that would
Yeah.
actually be the most useful part. Core to the lemon test, or to the third prong, there are three prongs. The third prong of the lemon test is this notion of entanglement. This idea that when government and religious institutions start doing business with each other in certain ways, the idea that the government is going to provide funding, it's likely to have its funding used in order to do religious stuff, to advance religion. And this started to worry the Supreme Court. Later on, people have wondered what entanglement is all about. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor famously understood it in terms of endorsement, that really the idea of entanglement, the problem that we're getting at is when government does that, it looks like it's endorsing religion and making non-religious citizens feel like second-class citizens.
Mm-hmm.
You can see how, like, even here, the concepts are a bit fuzzy.
They are, but like you've been in a workplace and like I'm thinking like entanglement, like a workplace relationship. There's a boss who's like, there's an entanglement with somebody in the office and it will make other people uncomfortable because now they're entangled with one another. Like, is he going to get preferential treatment? Is he going to get treated worse? Is she favored now or he favored now? And there's this sense that like if two entities that are supposed to be separate, supposed to have certain boundaries with one another, become entangled with one another, it's going to lead to an improper relationship, not just between them, but between everybody else in the office, so to speak, all the other institutions, all the other religions in this case, or the other non-religions.
Yeah, that was really Justice O'Connor's contribution, which in many ways is very attractive to me, to think about it in terms of endorsement and the way in which the non-adherents would feel like second-class political citizens. And that's what the Establishment Clause was meant to prevent. So, that's the idea that you get in the 60s and 70s, even the early 80s. And the idea there is like we really shouldn't have any aid going from government to religious institutions. Under that rule, this is religious institutions, Jewish day schools, they want money.
You're on your own.
Yeah. Absolutely not. Now, what's interesting is, even if you look at this history, which I find endlessly fascinating, it's true that in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, this is where the Supreme Court is. And this is where most of American Judaism is, pushing for these kinds of decisions. It is not where American Orthodox Judaism is.
Where are American Orthodox Jews right now? Meaning most of American Jewry, the big three that you mentioned, ADL, AJC, and I'm missing one.
AJC also. I don't know why.
American Jewish Conference.
American Jewish Congress and American Jewish Committee. Why is it that there are three? Yeah, why'd they do that? It's not right.
That's why we picked 1840. We didn't any acronyms with J. You're going to step on somebody else's acronym.
Yeah, nobody's picked 1840.
Nobody's picked 1840. I wonder why. But the basic feeling in mainstream American Jewry is this is a good idea. We should be totally separate. Because thinking about like using prayer in public schools as a test case, we don't want the government telling us what to do. But Orthodox Jews kind of broke from the pact in the 70s and the 60s. How did they break from the pact and why did they break from the pact?
So you got to try to put yourself in the mindset of like 1960s. 1960s, American Orthodox Judaism, people thought it was
on its last breath.
Yeah, it wasn't going to survive. And it didn't have really its own arms of advocacy. It was part of the AJCs and the ADL. Like, it was just a piece of the puzzle. And so it didn't have its own voice. And where it started to get its own voice was on this issue of equal funding, Meaning, think about your average government funding program. Let's take a nice one. Historic preservation grants. Let's imagine something happened relatively recently. New Jersey says we're going to allocate $10 million to historic preservation grants. And here are the criteria.
It's money that you can use to restore or preserve some major institution, building, or whatever.
Yeah, whatever criteria you want. You have to be super duper old and like super duper important. And here's like a 12-part test to figure out the answer. So they allocate $10 million. Now, when you do that, think about it. If you're really under this kind of rubric that you're thinking about in terms of like no money ever, what you're saying is, even though you qualify under the terms of the funding program, you're old, you're important, but because imagine you're a religious institution, you're a church, we are still not going to give you the money. That was the commitment. That was the proposition of these cases of no funding to religious institutions.
If you are a synagogue, if you are a church, we don't care if you qualify. We're not going to give you money to preserve your building or to rehabilitate or whatever, because there is a separation between church and state and you are excluded from this funding.
Right.
Were there cases that allowed that exclusion?
There are some minor cases around books and buses and odds and ends, but the cases in the 70s start to push back against this. The reason why I mentioned this structure of the problem is because we're not talking about instances where the religious institution doesn't qualify. You don't need separation of church and state then, right?
Correct.
You didn't qualify. You don't get the money.
Like, we're not preserving lighthouses or your doghouse in your backyard. We don't care how old it is.
So what we're saying is, even though the
You do
secular
qualify.
terms, the secular objective of the funding program, you qualify, you still don't get the money. And that's what Orthodoxy fought back against. They said, if our institution qualifies, whatever the secular terms are of the funding program, whether it's historic preservation grants or money to educational institutions, to schools, we should get the money on equal terms with every institution like us. And from their vantage point, excluding Jewish schools, excluding religious institutions, that's not an issue of separation of church and state. They viewed it as religious discrimination. You can see how you can view the same government move to say no money to the religious institutions, the chumrah, so to speak, on the Establishment Clause, this stringency of like extra separation of church and state, when pushed too far, starts to look like a kula on religious discrimination. We're being more lenient. We're allowing actual religious discrimination.
And who led this battle charge? Who deserves the credit in history for noticing this and saying this is becoming problematic?
The first source that comes to mind is testimony that Moshe Sher, who then led the Aguda, gave before Congress in 1961.
My father was his doctor briefly.
Yeah, he mentioned that in the testimony.
I appreciate that. They were very, very close, and he was a name constantly spoken about in our home.
So he got up in front of Congress and he said, you're used to American Jews coming here and telling you they're completely pro-separation of church and state. I want you to understand not all American Jews think that, and that Orthodox Jews don't think that, and we think it's a problem. We think that government should be funding on equal terms, not more, but not less, than other similarly situated institutions, and failure to do so is discrimination. I think that's really 1961 Moshe Sher.
That's in 1961.
Yeah.
That's more than 50 years ago.
Yeah, no, this has been a long-standing commitment. And in fact, it's around this issue, it galvanizes parts of the American Orthodox Jewish community, and they start to build their own advocacy arms. They realize that the institutions of American Jewish advocacy don't represent the way they view the world and their interests. And I mentioned both of those, both their needs and their values. And I think both pieces are important.
This is now in the 60s, 70s. They're still a tiny minority. Is this the status quo for 50 years to 60 years?
So you continue to have this kind of fight, like Supreme Court cases saying more and more separation of church and state. American Orthodoxy still pushing 60s, 70s, saying, no, this is discrimination. Other places where you find it are things like the sermons of Rabbi Lamb. I always say, I would love if my rabbi was talking about the First Amendment from the pulpit, once every 10 weeks. I think everybody else that would be super boring. But for me, it would be interesting.
Be in the front row,
oh my
fully
God,
locked in.
Absolutely amazing. Rabbi Lamb talks about the First Amendment.
Does he really talk about it a lot?
So many times. He has all these metaphors. He's critical of the rest of American Judaism. He talks about how they've traded the First Commandment for the First Amendment. They're more committed to the wall of separation than the Western Wall. He has all these
Oh, really? Smart,
yeah.
clever play on words. I mean, he was a master.
He was the best.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can read his, just all day. It's absolutely incredible.
You've
and
had some nice plays on words yourself. Maybe we'll get to some of those. Some of my all-time favorites.
Yeah, I know your all-time favorite. You just want me to say goose and gander.
I do want you to say goose and gander, but we'll get to it later from your famous Wall Street Journal op-ed. But moving forward, so Rabbi Lamb...
You get it in sermons, you get it in like testimony before Congress, and then you get the formation of COLPA, the National Jewish Commission on Law and Public Affairs. And they are, some of the people like Marvin Schick who really pushed the agenda of COLPA, then subsequently Nat Lewin, people who saw this and said, we need our own advocacy arms that really tried to push through amicus briefs before the court to have a different voice for Judaism.
Was Marvin Schick a trained lawyer? I don't know. Yeah. What was his...
All
I know about him was his paid op-eds that he would take out space in the Jewish Week after week, and write like his own op-ed there. It fascinated me. Do you remember those?
Yeah, for sure. But like you go back to some of the stuff he wrote in the 60s. I mean, he foresaw like 80% of the stuff we're dealing with. Like just when they formed COLPA and like he understood what the problems were and where the funding issues were. And also like he talks about how like so much of the Orthodox advocacy in the 60s, like they thought they were going to deal with the funding issue, but so much of it ended up being litigation around helping Jews keep Shabbos, which continues to be a problem to this very day. It really like everything in his diagnosis of like what Orthodox advocacy needed to look like in the 60s rings as true today as it did then. I'm mesmerized by so much of what he wrote and what he put out there on this subject.
He passed away fairly recently.
Yeah. So you see him building like with others, Moshe Scherer and others, advocacy, litigation strategy, sermons, that it's not just part of what's in law and politics, but also part of what we hear in shul. Like the idea being that excluding religion from government funding programs, forget about the dollars even, that kind of discrimination meant that Jews were less than when it came to citizenship. We couldn't be equal citizens because our institutions, even when they qualified for government funding, they weren't going to get it because of this, at least in my view, outsized view of the separation of church and state. And that's kind of the state of play, I want to say, up until 2000. State of play, courts kind of against, slowly but surely creeping up and changing a little bit, Orthodox advocacy pushing, other forms or more progressive arms of American Judaism still saying, no, we need more and more separation of church and state.
When do things begin to change?
2000, you start getting opinions from the Supreme Court where they move away from this idea, even earlier, I should say, but like really solidifying in like 2000, 2001, 2002.
Is there a specific case?
I've had Mitchell v. Helms in mind. I've got Zellman v. Simmons Harris, cases about vouchers or related to vouchers. Okay. Where the court starts to say, government funding for religious institutions isn't a problem so long as we're committed to the principle of neutrality. Think about endorsement again. It's a useful way to think about it. If you think the problem is you don't want people to feel like a second-class citizen, you can imagine the following rejoinder. Nobody thinks we're privileging religion if we're giving the same amount to everyone. And that's what the Supreme Court starts to push. They start to say, you know what? If governments want to, they can treat religious institutions neutrally. And if like institutions, they're all getting $10, send $10 to the church, send $10 to the Jewish day school. That is okay. And it gets authorized, in this case, Zellman v. Simmons Harris, in terms of vouchers in the state of Ohio. So that's like the first big move or change in 2000. This creates like a little bit of a puzzle, and it brings us back to the 19th century. Because you're allowed to treat religion equally, like you would any other similarly situated institution. But you remember I said to you, half the states have these rules on the books, no money ever to religious stuff, right?
On the state level.
On the state level, exactly. So great. The First Amendment says you can, and the states say, yeah, but we have rules that say we won't. And then the question is, well, wait a minute. If you're allowed to give the money, does withholding it look like religious discrimination? Think about that for a second, right? I mean, there's nothing preventing you anymore. Why aren't you giving the religious school the money? You might say, oh, separation of church and state. But the Supreme Court said, no, that's not a problem anymore. You can do it now. So now it's like a question, if I'm not giving it, well, it's not because of the First Amendment.
Is there still money being withheld on the state level from these old mini Blaine amendments or whatever it is?
All over the place. Tons of laws on the books everywhere. Tons of state laws that not even in terms of just state constitutions, but written into various legislation that says if you're a sectarian institution, you need not apply. Sectarian means religious. Some people view it as code word for anti-Catholic, but okay, fine. And so this becomes the question in the early 2000s. Can states still exclude religion even though they're allowed to include them?
Is there a breaking point where the Supreme Court kind of says it explicitly, this is a problem?
So in 2004, you get this fun little case, Locke v. Davey. You got this guy, his name is Joshua Davey. Jokes on everybody else. He eventually became a lawyer. I was talking to a friend of mine last night who told me he was in his church and state class at Harvard Law School. He was sitting near him.
With this guy who was
he was asked to recount for class the story of his case.
Okay.
Which is hilarious. You'll see why in a sec. So Joshua Davey, he applies for this scholarship. I think it's called like a Promise Keeper Scholarship in the state of Washington. And it works something like this. Like if you did pretty well in high school and you're of relatively low socioeconomic status, you get a scholarship. Problem is you can't get the scholarship
and
if
use the money.
Exactly. Use the money if you want to pursue a degree in devotional theology. That's kind of how it worked. There's some ambiguities in there, but that's basically how it works.
And that would exclude some religious universities. Probably.
Yeah, so this guy, Joshua Davey, is like, I want to pursue a degree in devotional theology. And he's told he can't keep his scholarship.
And he won it fair and square.
Correct. Based on the terms of the scholarship, he should get the scholarship. So he takes his case all the way to the Supreme Court. He says, they're discriminating against me. What the hell? The Supreme Court says, Joshua Davey, you lose. 2004 is what they say. They say you lose because ultimately we have this long history and tradition of like not funding people going into, I guess, the equivalent of the rabbinate, people learning to become pastors, clergy,
The government's not going to subsidize your religious journey.
Not just religious journey, but like specifically like religious leaders, pastors, clergy.
Gotcha.
This goes back to the beginning of the founding, the idea that tax dollars would support the clergy. That was viewed as a real problem. And instead, the Supreme Court kind of describes what it calls play in the joints. That's kind of the principle it articulates.
Is that the language they use?
Yeah, this is like the famous
Playing the joints.
Play in the joints.
What a clumsy phrase. What does that mean?
I think it's kind of catchy.
Play in the joints? What does
The
that refer
idea
to?
is that just because the Establishment Clause doesn't prohibit something doesn't mean automatically you should view it as religious discrimination. There's something in between the two. Something that, like, it's not prohibited, but states if you want to, you can still exclude religion. Play in the joints. And that's what they say. They say, listen, if the state of Washington here, in this case, given kind of the concerns that they have, this isn't religious discrimination. This is just a concern about this notion of separation of church and state, even though they'd be allowed to give the money. And everybody thinks this is the end, meaning 2004, the Supreme Court spoke. Neutrality is the term, the principle driving separation of church and state. And even though that's the case, states can give the money. They don't have to. So over half the states that have these kind of mini Blaine amendments, New York's got one, New Jersey's got one, places where it might be particularly relevant for Jewish day schools. Everyone thinks that's it. All right, so 2017 rolls around. The state of Missouri unveils this environmental program, and it goes something like this. Evidently, nonprofits are building stuff where they need tires. I don't know why, but they need tires. And Missouri
Tires like for cars.
Yeah, like, well, you're going to learn not just for cars, but yeah, we typically associate these tires with cars.
Okay.
But they're like, here's the deal. If you're a nonprofit and you need tires for some sort of building project, if you use recycled tires, we'll give you a grant to offset the cost of those tires. And so lots of nonprofits file to try to get grants for recycled tires. Why not? Yeah, they want recycled tires. And this Trinity Lutheran Church and School in Missouri, they also apply. They want to build a new playground, and they want to do new bouncy. You know what I'm talking about? The black stuff that the kids jump on in a playground? No?
Bouncy?
You know, and if you fall, you don't hurt yourself so
yeah,
badly.
Oh, like in, I don't know, it's that color. They're like multicolored. In a playground, it's like that, like cushioning.
Yeah, the cushioning. I think of it as black. Maybe around here you have very fancy,
yeah,
bouncy.
Like multicolored.
That sounds great.
Okay.
I'm so glad you have multicolored. Yeah, okay. It's normally black, okay? So they apply, and they get a letter that says, you would have qualified to get this grant. Everything was in perfect order, but because you are a religious institution and the Missouri State Constitution says no money going directly or indirectly to a religious school, therefore you cannot. It was like completely clear as to what the issue was, almost as if like a clerk was trying to set up litigation. And so Trinity Lutheran file suit. They say this is religious discrimination. They go up and they go up. They go all the way up to the Supreme Court.
And what's this case called?
It's called Trinity Lutheran v. Comer.
Okay. Comer is state clerk or something?
No. It was somebody in the state. I'm not sure which official it was.
He's a dude,
state.
but he got his name on the Supreme Court case. That's always fun, no? Is it a badge of honor to get your name in a Supreme Court case? Do people want that? Like you kind of get enshrined in history.
I don't know. Maybe. I mean, definitely not if you lose.
Okay.
I mean, who wants to be a loser?
It's kind of my brand, but yeah.
So
they're excluded from the tire funding.
Yeah, so they can't get the tire funding. They go up to the Supreme Court. They make this argument. They say it's religious discrimination. And the state of Missouri says back,
play in the joints?
Play in the joints, exactly. Locke v. Davey. We already decided this kind of case. You know, what's the issue? Yes, we're allowed to give them the money because it would be neutral. We'd be treating everybody the same.
But this is a dangerous game.
This is something where we get to be a little bit more expansive in terms of saying we have this law in the books. We've had it for a long time, and we think that we want to be church and state to be more separate than is constitutionally required. And here the Supreme Court in 2017 says, actually, we're going to side with Trinity Lutheran. We think you have to give them the funding. This is religious discrimination. Now, you're asking yourself, well, then what happened to 2004 Locke v. Davey? How did this case become different? So in 2017, the Supreme Court says something a little bit funky, and it says, here's the deal. The reason why Trinity Lutheran wins is because they were discriminated against because of who they are as an institution, their institutional status. Joshua Davey, he was excluded because he wanted to use the money for something religious. So you can't say, you're a religious institution, therefore you're out. But you can say, oh, you're going to use it for something religious? That estate is allowed to say, we're not giving you the money to use for something religious.
And this distinction is known as
the status use distinction.
It sounds extraordinarily Talmudic. Are you coming on a particular side of whether or not learning Gemara can actually help you on the LSATs? Are you weighing in on that right now?
I'm definitely not weighing in on that. I look forward to our next podcast together
the
where
real
we talk
one.
about how Gemara does and doesn't help you in law school. Yeah, that would be a fun one. I'm not opining on that.
But they make
today.
the status use distinction. If it's discrimination based on status, then it is no good.
Correct.
If it's discrimination based on use, good to go. Locke v. Davey, discriminate away. You can do this because then you're playing in the joints. Now,
David, you sound at this point, you're pretty much a lawyer now.
Oh, I'm very lawyerly. But you did something about this distinction. We're like so deep in the weeds now. But the reason why I want to do this, I just want to explain, is I feel like there's so much ignorance when people talk about these issues. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. You are an Orthodox Jew. You are deeply involved in constitutional issues. You would say your area of expertise is, how do you describe it?
Law and religion not getting along.
So you probably get a lot of this like Shabbos table banter. And like, to me, we're just mired in ignorance. We don't know the history of these things. We don't understand how they've come to evolve, what interests they are protecting on both sides, both religious interests and state interests, both of which every American Jew should be invested in protecting properly. You've witnessed such ignorance.
So to me, I'm deeply passionate about this stuff. I care quite a lot about it. I feel like it's part of my American Jewish identity to care about these issues. These issues have been central to who we've been as American Jews, as a people. Mm-hmm. It's been one of the most important issues of advocacy over time. It's where Orthodox Jewish advocacy was born. I am an Orthodox Jew, and I care deeply about how my faith community, how it evolved in terms of its relationship to government, what its expectations are, what its responsibilities are, and the idea that buried in this issue of whether or not we should get funding on equal terms was not only a desire to get dollars, but was also an aspiration that we should be equal citizens under the law. The idea that just because of our religious commitments, we wouldn't get funding is another way of saying, at least to me, what I hear when I hear those words is it means that because of what I believe, I do not have the same relationship with my government that every other citizen gets to have.
And this issue, this distinction, we're now still in 2017. We're in the Lutheran church case. They're fighting to get their tires. It's a hard thing to get passionate about, but here we are. And the court comes out with the status use distinction. Is this where the story ends? Because that distinction sounds very murky. And one of the most fascinating things I've ever read from you was talking about how status use distinguishing between kind of the status of the institution, we're a religious institution, versus how you're using it. Are you using it religiously? Almost works against the Jewish community.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of constitutional distinctions, where the Supreme Court draws a line in the constitutional sand. And it makes sense if your experience of religion is this privatized Protestant view of, how religion works. But it doesn't resonate if, your religious experience is through conduct, through action. I would even say, as an Orthodox Jew, engaging in activities that most of the world views as secular, and we view it as religious.
What's an example of this? And where you see the status use distinction break down in the Jewish lens that you're coming at it.
Yeah, I think you know this. My favorite example of this is, and where it came to me was, so we were doing construction during COVID, and because we are who we are, we lived through the construction. So my house has no walls, and it feels a little bit like a loony bin. It's COVID. You all know what this deal is. And I've got at that point a 2-year-old or 3-year-old. I don't even know how old my kids are anymore at this point. And
forgetting your kid's age was the sign of
age, names, and she's walking through a construction zone. I think she's going to end up in the concrete. That's basically where we're at. while this is all going on, I'm like, I want to build a deck. That's what I wanted. I want a little nice outdoor space up top where I could go hang out.
Escape.
Have you been?
I've been on your deck.
Okay, good.
I think I've eaten a fair amount of cheese on your deck.
I didn't want to bring that up, but okay, that's good. Now, one of the things I didn't know halachically, as a matter of Jewish law, that if you have a deck that's on top of living space, it is obligated under Jewish law's rules regarding building a fence around a roof.
What's known as a makkah.
Yeah, exactly. A ma'akeh. I now have to build, I'm halachically obligated under Jewish law to build a fence around this deck. We may as well do a shout out here. I actually consulted first with my father and then Rabbi Ari Zatz, who's here. Who's here in me too.
Married to Michael, formerly Guilford, great friend of the family.
Oh, that's good. So Ari's an old friend from high school, college, a chavrusa, and I called him up. I'm like, okay, I need to do this. And like, when do I make the blessing, the bracha on the ma'akeh? Like, how does it work? There's a blessing
that you make.
Oh, yeah. Oh, this
People
is the
don't
whole
know
thing.
that.
This whole thing's amazing. Yeah, so there I am, and he kind of walks me through, like, do you do it at the beginning when you build it or at the end? Okay, and I have to do part of it.
And the blessing's probably made like once a year, like of all of jewelry. How many people are making building a
He seemed up to date.
He seemed up to date. This is happening more than we think.
Yeah, Rabbi Zatz is always up to date. He knows the score right away. So I go out there and I have to participate in it. So my contractor, actually his foreman, gives me his nail gun and I'm firing. This is a terrible idea, do you understand? I'm firing nail guns into the wood of my ma'akeh, of my fence, and there it is. It strikes me as I'm doing this. This is something my contractor, Edwin, was going to do. And he thinks this is hilarious. And we took a video and he finds it so interesting.
Because you're building it yourself to fulfill this commandment.
He's probably laughing at me trying to accomplish this. Like there's recoil from the nail gun and I'm like flying back and I'm taking a video and he's taking a video of him making a blessing, putting it on the family WhatsApp, everything you do. And it strikes me like for him, this is just like the normal thing he does every day, right? And to me, it's a religious activity that I'm making a blessing on.
And then it dawns upon you that status use distinction. Imagine a state law that gives funding for renovations.
Exactly.
You can give to status. You can't exclude based on your status, but you can exclude for use. So let's say you use this funding to...
Yeah, so imagine like we give funding for a building, whatever it is. Think about any state funding for a building and think about a state that says its state constitution prohibits providing funding to religious institutions, okay? Or religious schools, whatever it may be. That means in any situation where it's allowed to prohibit, it must prohibit. So what are we saying right now? We're going to give you funding for the building, and we have all this building code stuff, right, that you need to make sure, health and safety when you build the building. But we're now going to have to, as a matter of state law, exclude all money for the fence to protect people from falling off because you, as an Orthodox Jew, view that as religious and now it's religious use? Like, is this really where the law is at? Any time that we as Jews are engaged in a religious activity that everyone else thinks is secular, the states that have this rule must exclude it. Think about COVID vaccines for a second, right? You know, the Orthodox Union. I do lots of advocacy with the Orthodox Union. We did advocacy in Trinity Lutheran. We filed a brief. In some of the subsequent cases I'll talk about, we filed briefs. And we make this point in a 2022 brief. Think about COVID vaccines. The OU was of the view, Rabbi Mordechai Willig came out and said he thinks there is a mitzvah, commandment, to take a vaccine. Okay, now wait a minute. If there are public-private partnerships in states regarding vaccines, because Orthodox Jews viewed as a religious use, now the state can't fund it.
So the boundaries, the partition, when we talk about church and state, we think about these neat little categories, which is probably like a little bit of like a Christian categorization. You have your church and you have your home, and never the two shall meet. There's a way to divide between the church and the state. But the problem is when the church, especially in Jewish life, kind of permeates all of your behaviors, to cordon off use becomes much trickier. Now, is this distinction still on the books?
So 2022 comes along and there's this other case, Carson v. Macon, lovely case. It's in the state of Maine. Maine has over half its school districts don't have a public high school. So what do you do if you live in one of those school districts? Maine has this rule. What it says is if you live in one of those school districts, you can go to a private school and we'll provide tuition for it. It's their tuition assistance program. That's how Maine worked because it wasn't providing you with a public school. But from 1980 and on, it introduced a rule that said, however, if the school you choose is a sectarian school, a religious school, then that school can't get the funding. And they've been fighting this for years.
Who's they?
Lots of parents. Parents have been filing suit, saying it's religious discrimination, and they kept on losing these parents in federal court. But in 2022, this ends up in front of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in 2022 says, hold on a second, we think this is religious discrimination to exclude religious schools. It's just like Trinity Lutheran. Now, here's the interesting thing. One of the things that Maine said that a lower federal court bought was, no. This isn't discrimination based on religious status.
It's religious use.
It's being used for religion in these schools. And therefore, this is religious use. And even under Trinity Lutheran, even under this distinction, this is religious use. We're allowed to discriminate. And the Supreme Court finally said, you know what?
Enough.
This distinction doesn't work because I can almost always redescribe religious use as religious status and back and forth. You can see even in the school context, they said no money to sectarian schools. Sounds like it's religious status, right? But they said, no, it really means not religious schools, but schools that use money for religious purposes. We can play this game all day. It's not a good distinction. It's one that is easily open to manipulation. And so the Supreme Court now says, no matter what it is, religious status, religious use, it cannot be the case that you exclude religion or religious institutions from a government funding program.
And this has potentially massive implications for Jewish education.
Yeah, this is a big, big deal at this point because there are tons of programs out there that are available for institutions generally, private institutions. Government doesn't have to fund private institutions, but once it does, it can't say except for religious institutions.
And all of these state laws that are now in existence could really be deemed unconstitutional because if they're singling out institutions just based on their religious status or use, because that now distinction is ridiculous, it's not relevant anymore, you could potentially bring lawsuits and say, we deserve this funding as well.
That's right. I have the pleasure, I run a religious liberty clinic where students at Pepperdine Crusoe School of Law participate in a clinic where they get to practice as lawyers. I think we're going to bring one of these lawsuits in the coming month. In fact, by the time
this airs, likely this is already...
decent chance we'll have already filed suit.
Do you think these lawsuits are going to make the news?
Could be. One of the things is things that make the news is usually about like things that make it to the Supreme Court. To me, these things are so obvious what the outcome is now.
Really, it's that obvious to you?
I don't see how, given the current state of law, given Supreme Court precedent, you can have state laws that say except for religion. That's just religious discrimination prohibited by the First Amendment. I have the pleasure of working with the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty on a lawsuit they'll probably bring out in California. In California right now, this is something that drives me insane. There's this thing called being a non-public school. Doesn't mean what you think it means. It's a school that is capable of providing services to special needs kids. And it can provide services to special needs kids under circumstances where the public schools are not able to do so. And if there's a circumstance where the public schools can't do it and the private school, the non-public school, takes over and is able to provide services for like a kid that really needs a lot of services, the tuition dollars go from the public schools to the private school. Makes sense, right? Because the public school can't do its job. So, it offloads it to the private school. And the rule is right now, but you can't be a non-public school if you're a religious school. And this drives me nuts. I mean, I got to know a little bit some of the special needs parents in the area. And like you listen to what they're going through, and it's awful terrible. And the idea that there would be a school out there that could like provide services for a kid.
For their children. But the only reason they're not able to get these services.
And the public school can't do it and the private school can do it, but they need resources to make it happen. And the idea that like everything can work, except we have this rule that says, oh, you're a religious school, so like, you're out of the picture. And it infuriates me to no end. And, our goal is to file suit and say, listen, you have to stop doing this. If a school can provide these kinds of services, stop excluding religious institutions that can provide the secular benefit. I want to emphasize that. The secular benefit of providing for the needs of a child with an IEP, an individualized educational program, if you can provide and help a child in these sorts of circumstances, the idea that antiquated views of church and state are going to prevent that from happening, I mean, I can get pretty worked up about this stuff.
Let me ask you, zoom out, because I have a whole nother topic, and we've been talking for a while already. People who criticize, you mentioned working with the Beckett Fund. There is some suspicion, hesitation that people see in the Orthodox world cozying up with causes that maybe the evangelical world, the religious world, that we've been co-opted by Christian values. That is concern number one that I've heard. Concern number two is that the whole turn of the Supreme Court really came through a Trump-elected court. And I think of all the people I know, I hate talking politics. I absolutely hate it. One of the most avowed centrists I know happened to be you. I really mean that as the highest praise. But there are people who look with a great deal of suspicion at the Supreme Court. And I'm curious for you, do you feel like the Supreme Court decision should be met with like an asterisk, like a Barry Bonds asterisk? Like, we got this decision on steroids, but like we have to make note of the fact that like this was the Trump Supreme Court. And I think my last question, and these are all cousins, they're not all the same. Do you think it's dangerous for the Orthodox community to have a transactional relationship with government, that so much of our efforts is to secure dollars?
Well, luckily you put together three questions that are really simple. So the answers are yes, no, and yes. No, in all seriousness, maybe I want to start at the end. Litigation around equal funding to be treated on equal terms as every other institution of a similar class, other institutions that satisfy secular government interests. I want to say one, every faith community, every interest group advocates for benefits that they think are in the interests of their community. And this is something the framers long understood. They wanted ambition to counteract ambition, but that ultimately, in some way, the idea that interest groups would advocate for themselves, there's nothing that's problematic about that.
It's not nefarious to have self-interest.
I don't think so.
It's almost by design. It's not a bug of democracy to advocate for your self-interest.
That's right. I don't personally buy into that.
And you've heard such accusations.
All the time. I want to say more than that, though, in this particular context. Even if there were $0 at stake in these cases, I think it is not surprising that this is where American Orthodox advocacy was born. It was born out of an idea that having access to the same benefits and responsibilities, but benefits that are available to every other American citizen, should be available to us and to our institutions. And anytime we are short a cent on that, it's not that we need to care about the dollar as much as we have a right to care about our equal standing. And that the access to benefits on the same terms as every other American citizen is about our fight for equal citizenship in the United States. So I push back hard on the idea that this sort of litigation, what we've been talking about in this context, is transactional. I want to say, one, it's not clear to me that pressing your interests is a problem. And two, I actually think there is a core value to push back against discrimination, against subordination that comes when we think it's okay to say, yes, everybody, but the religious folks.
And what would you say about that last point? I'm just curious. The asterisk around the Supreme Court, you hang out in legal circles. I'm sure you've heard people who look at the Supreme Court with an asterisk. I'm curious for you, is that a factor? You've heard the asterisk. Do you use the asterisk?
So to me, when I read opinions, when I read anything, I assume the authors of opinions and the people who write and say are acting in good faith. I don't ascribe nefarious motives to people who are expressing a view and explaining why they have that view. I would like to think that's my disposition in any part of my life. When the Supreme Court issues an opinion, I read the opinion like I would read anything else. There's justifications. The justifications and the arguments look like law to me. And to me, I just evaluate the arguments on the merits. Sometimes I agree and sometimes I disagree. I think the asterisk that you're pointing to is people think, and therefore it's no longer law. It's politics all the way down. That's not my view. To me, it all looks like law. And sometimes I agree and sometimes I disagree, and vehemently so, on either side of the ledger. But I don't see things going on that make me think that this is a different kind of enterprise going on now. And I would say, I spent a lot of my life, when Supreme Court opinions come out, just writing something to try and explain what I think the arguments are, because I think you're right. Most of the time this gets digested as politics all the way down. Correct. He did this because this is what he is, and this person did this because this is what she is. And to me, it's lazy. And we should engage the arguments and assume good faith and try to look at, do we agree or disagree with what's going on? So to me, it looks all the same, even as I agree and disagree with stuff. But that's how it always is. There are legal arguments that we think are better and worse based on a variety of factors and methodologies. So I don't buy that at all. I want to say one last thing. Your first question of cozying up. I hate that so much.
Tell me why. Why do you hate it? You've heard that. I'm not the first person to say it.
I've heard it, and why not? We're here. So a person I have a tremendous amount of respect for, Professor Noah Feldman, responded to an article I wrote in Jewish Review of Books, a little bit describing this entire push for government dollars as part of a larger picture of Orthodox Jews and Orthodox lawyers, and me cozying up to evangelicals, cozying up to a conservative Christian right. And I find it I want to say, I should be honest, I find it offensive. And the reason I find it offensive is because like this advocacy is our story. It's not somebody else's story.
We started this game.
Yeah, this is like in the 1960s, like this is how we began to understand what the values were that were essential to an agenda of Orthodox advocacy. That it was important to us both to fund our institutions and to be treated like other American citizens. And we thought the other arms of American Judaism weren't representing those values. And so we struck out on our own and we said, we're going to build the infrastructure to make these points. And for somebody to
We didn't jump onto the Christian evangelical bandwagon.
Yeah, this is us. This is who we are. This is what we believe in. This is our perception of how it is American Orthodoxy went from a denomination that in the 1960s was small and relatively weak.
Powerless almost.
Yeah, and subject to discrimination when it came to like observing Shabbat, observing the Sabbath, and had hard time getting jobs and had hard time getting into hotels and all of these things that American Orthodoxy experienced in the 50s and the 60s. And we said, no, we're going to fight back. And we think equal citizenship is a core proposition of that. Whether it was getting a job, whether it was getting government funding, we're entitled to all of that. And to re-describe that as like somebody else's story that we're just jumping onto is to deny us, I think, American Orthodox Jews who we are. And so I reject it with every fabric of what I do. I spend a lot of time on Orthodox Jewish advocacy, and I think it's the wrong story to tell. I think the right story to tell, the one that's sensitive and accurate and really talks about how it is we created who we are in this country and have become really, we have an agenda that's serious and thoughtful and protects a particular way of life.
And the values of this country, frankly.
Yeah. And I think to deny that is like to do violence to who we are. That's really what it comes down to.
Have you noticed there's been a turning of the tides? It's not exclusively the Orthodox community. Coalitions have also reached out to other denominations who have joined, Solomon Schechter's, who are involved in advocating for these, because it's begun to affect not just exclusively the Orthodox world. I'm curious if in the coalitions you come, is it just black hats and yarmulkes?
I don't think so. I think on the funding issue, I think people see kind of a straight line in terms of this religious discrimination argument. You know, you can have different views on it, by the way. I want to be crystal clear. To continue to be like fully committed to separation of church and state and say government should not be providing this funding is a completely principled position that has an incredible amount of integrity, that has a long history to it. And it's perfectly fine to say the Supreme Court is getting all these cases wrong. I have no objection to that. And the institutions of American Judaism that continue to press that argument are being principled and true to who they are. No issues. But, you know, more and more institutions are beginning to see this as this kind of religious discrimination question. And I do think as a result, when it comes to this kind of advocacy, you do see more institutions kind of jumping on what I would say is the Orthodox bandwagon, the one that we built in the 60s.
Since the 60s. We spoke a great deal about funding, and it sounds like there are some very exciting developments in where this is headed. But I want to turn to a subject that I found almost one of the hardest subjects to discuss publicly because the intensity of opinion on both sides is so difficult to navigate, which is why I specifically wanted you to talk about this, because I've really said as a point not only of affection but of real admiration that you are the educator-in-chief when it comes to legal issues related to religion and the larger Jewish community.
I need to tell you, I changed one of my fantasy football team names to educator-in-chief.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Okay, so some of the pristine and the shine on that term just like kind of left, that it's now the name for a fantasy football team. But be it as it may, you really do call balls and strikes on this issue. And there is an issue that is roiling not just the Jewish community, but has become a national issue. And that is educational standards, particularly within Hasidic schools, within yeshivas, and the question of what should the position of a Jew like myself. I was raised in a school that had a very fine secular and Jewish education. I can't really speak to what goes on in Hasidic schools. I definitely hear and am deeply sensitive to people who feel that they were not given an adequate education. But the question is, what is the role of government in ensuring that all schools are giving an adequate education, whether they are religious, whether they are not religious? And I guess this issue kind of spiraled because of the very intense coverage this has gotten from the New York Times, which has run several articles really focused and narrowed in on the Hasidic community. I'm curious, as a legal scholar, before we get into the parameters of the case, are you familiar with those New York Times articles?
Yeah, I've definitely given them a read.
Do you think that there are missing pieces? When you read them, again, you read everything kind of through a very legal lens. So what are you thinking when you're reading an article that is focused on the level of education in Hasidic schools?
Listen, when I read something like that, I'm a little bit of a data-driven guy, so I'm trying to figure out like how the numbers work and what's going on. You know, there are things about it that are more clear and less clear. I mean, listen, there's no question that this is an issue of major concern. And so, you know, I become immediately attuned to this issue of like, well, you know, how is this supposed to be working? And, you know, I'm a legal scholar, so my brain immediately goes to the law. Like,
let's go there. Let's start with just first legal principles. We began with the separation of church and state. Why don't I say that I have the right of free exercise? Let me run my school the way I want. I'll run a school in my backyard. I'll run a school in my home. Why do they have the right to tell any school what they should or should not be teaching?
Couple things. So when it comes to like the First Amendment questions of religious liberty, I should have the religious right to teach whatever I want to my kids.
It's so fun.
Yeah, interesting. First of all, the idea of me teaching my kids sounds like terribly scary, probably more for them than for me. But more seriously, religious liberty, the idea that I have the right to exercise my religion, doesn't cover something like this. Meaning, the kind of religious liberty basics are government has the right to enforce a law, at least under current Supreme Court doctrine, that's neutral and what we say is generally applicable, that doesn't target religion in any way and applies across the board. So if the government wants to enact a rule that applies equally to everybody, same kind of a principle idea that we're talking about on the other side of the ledger, neutrality, the government has a right to say, at least when it comes to the First Amendment, religious liberty, to say, we're not going after religion, we're not targeting religion. Every child in the state of New York or whatever state it may be, has to satisfy certain educational criteria.
Is there a classic example of this? A rule that some people felt was infringing on their religious right, but the government's like, hey, this is general. It applies to everybody in the same way. What is like the vintage classic case where the government asserted its right to make such laws, even if it has some effects to the detriment of religious communities?
You've basically been baiting me into talking about Employment Division v. Smith.
Would I do that? I would never do that.
I can't believe this. This has been one big sham. So, you know, the Supreme Court announces this interpretation of the First Amendment in 1990, this case, Employment Division v. Smith. Lovely case where you have these two folks, Al Smith and Galen Black. And Al and Galen, their employer finds out that they have been ingesting peyote.
As one does.
I used to say, by the way, in class, smoking peyote. I don't know anything about drugs. So I used to
say... You
don't
smoke peyote?
Evidently not.
Is it peyote or peyote?
I may not even...
Smoking some peyote.
I don't know.
We'll have Mel Barinholtz call in. He for sure knows
if I could ask some
peyote.
Of your listeners to
they connect my pronunciation constantly.
Oh, yeah.
And I have no doubt that the Venn diagram of pronunciation correctors and peyote smokers, there's overlap within our listeners.
Actually, it isn't, because it turns out you don't smoke peyote. You ingest peyote.
It. Okay.
It's like a cactus.
Okay.
I had a student in a class correct me, and like, you know, when you're looking at somebody, you know they know
raised
more.
His hand, is like,
they know more about this topic than you do. I'm like, oh boy. Okay, so I've got articles out there where I'm talking about smoking peyote. Evidently, it's all nonsense.
Okay,
great. Now, of course, Al and Galen had the worst job in the world to have been discovered by their employer to be ingesting peyote.
What's the worst job in the world for someone who is ingesting peyote? A school bus driver?
This is some fun. I usually ask this question when I'm teaching the case, and I usually get like airplane pilots or something like that.
It's like a great
NASA.
film. What is the worst job to have if you are ingesting peyote for religious reasons?
But the number one is, which is what Al and Galen were, they were actually counselors in a drug rehab center.
Not a good job.
No, not a good job if you're going to be popping the shrooms. So they get terminated. Now, that's perfectly fine. Private employers are allowed to terminate them for this purpose. It's not religious discrimination. It's not covered by Title VII. We'll talk about Title VII another time. Okay, great. So what they do is they go to get unemployment benefits. That seems fair. This is in the state of Oregon. They're like, okay, we need unemployment benefits. And the state of Oregon says, well, why were you terminated? They have to tell, an obviously embarrassing story. And the state of Oregon says, you know what? You were terminated for cause. You screwed up. So you don't get any money. And they said, wait a minute. We weren't terminated for cause. The reason why we are ingesting peyote is because it's part of our Native American church practice. That's part of the service. We ingest peyote. I always think about this, like, imagine like if this was like...
That's where my head is right now.
Like
what service would I want? I mean, it's kind of like Purim, but like,
a little
imagine
bit.
I think some people have adopted this as a stringency in their own life.
That could be.
That they ingest something before they step into synagogue.
I just want to say, like,
such people.
Just think about what sermons would sound like. Do you know what I'm saying? Okay, good. Here's the point. So this goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ends up finding against Alan Galen, even though they say we did this for religious reasons. Don't tell us it's for cause. It's a religious reason. And you're now denying us a government benefit, unemployment benefits, because we engaged in a religious practice. Supreme Court says no. This is a rule that is applied across the board. It's neutral and generally applicable. We apply it to everybody. We have the same rules for everyone. We're not targeting religion. Guys, we get it. It sucks for you, but you're not getting unemployment benefits. And that's kind of where the Supreme Court announces this rule. So that's the rule that applies now. Still
general, applicable to everybody.
Neutral and generally applicable.
We have the right to make rules. Yeah. Even if some religious communities
are going to be negatively impacted. That's right. Step one, if you're doing a religious liberty analysis, is like, is this law neutral and generally applicable? And there's a strong argument that there is. I want to say in the litigation here, there have been some plaintiffs that have filed suit. They've made a religious liberty argument. I don't think that's where the main action is.
Okay.
The main action when it comes to school stuff is the 14th Amendment, which actually protects parents and gives them the right to control the upbringing of their children. It's derived from, a lot of things are derived from the 14th Amendment. When the 14th Amendment says that, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The question is what's the liberty interest that's going on in that sentence? This has been interpreted to cover lots of different issues. This is what's at stake when it comes to abortion. This is what's at stake when it comes to a whole host of what we call substantive due process issues. Contraception has been issued before the Supreme Court on this.
I have the right to control my own life and not the state interfering in my private affairs.
That's right. That there's some concept of liberty that's going on over here, some sort of fundamental right that I have here. And here the Supreme Court has said for over a century, parents have a right on this basis to control the upbringing of their children.
Over a century?
Yeah.
Is there an original founding case on this?
The two big cases are Pierce v. Society of Sisters and Meyer v. Nebraska, two twin cases from the early 20th century where the Supreme Court says, now getting nervous that the first case is actually 1925, so it's a little bit under a century, I think.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, okay.
We'll give you a pass on that.
I appreciate that. But in any event, the point here being, this is tried and true, this rule. There's some right to control the upbringing of your children. Now, it's not unlimited, but you have some right. This came up in some of the COVID cases where some private schools filed suit. Parents said, you can't force our kids to be on Zoom. We have a right to have them have in-person education. And again, this all went back to the 14th Amendment. So parents have the right to control the upbringing of their children. Now, the issue is it's not unlimited. So any case where we're going to be talking about parents want to do the following with their kids and the state wants to do something else, the core issue is going to be a 14th Amendment issue. Now, how do we decide what the limits are on this? So the typical way you would do this is you'd say, well, is there some sort of constitutional problem here on the front end? Is there a restriction going on? And if the state is imposing some sort of regulations that the parents don't want to abide by, you in theory have a 14th Amendment right. Here's the thing. That right can be overridden if the government needs to do it for some sort of compelling government interest.
And if it's general and applicable, meaning it's to everyone. They can't just single out religious schools.
They can't single out religious schools, that's true. But in the New York case,
they're not doing that.
They're not doing that, or at least not in a way that I think is sufficiently obvious in order to trigger First Amendment considerations. Again, some people would disagree with me on that. Some people would say, listen, if you look at who is actually...
They're whistling in that direction.
Could be, there are other ways that you can satisfy these requirements, and the only schools that don't satisfy the requirements end up being religious schools, and that starts to look like targeting religion. To me, the argument's a little bit too complicated. I don't think it wins the day. But there are people who make that argument, so we should give it a little bit of airtime.
Sure.
But the 14th Amendment argument, listen, parents don't want to do it. They say that's not how we want to control the upbringing of their kids. The state says, no, listen, we have a variety of requirements, basic four, English, math, history, science, you got to learn that. And in New York, there's actually a whole long, ancillary list, 8 other things that they require schools to do.
But we have a compelling interest that we want the citizens of this state to get a basic education.
Yeah, I think this is where the rubber meets the road. This is how the 14th Amendment analysis works. And in the New York case, I think it should be the same. We should run it through the same analysis we would run anything else through. There's probably a 14th Amendment issue here because parents want to do something else. I think, though, we have to now start to articulate more clearly when we say the government has an obligation, the authority to require every kid in their jurisdiction to get an education. I think we have to ask why. So when we say, yes, you have a 14th Amendment right, but there's some super duper important reason why the state needs to override that right, we need to say why. We can't say, I don't think the government has a right to require basic education. Why does the government need to require basic education? And to me, if you read Supreme Court case law, there are two primary reasons why that's true. The first is economic self-sufficiency. This is a compelling government interest, that the government has a compelling interest, even if it has to tell a parent, listen, we know you want to do something else, but we need to make sure that your kid learns certain stuff, whatever that may be, and that may change from year to year.
It's so funny. It sounds like a parent, but like usually parents, but it's the parent versus the state. Usually it's like your father-in-law, like, how are you going to earn a living, son? You know, and where did the Supreme Court articulate that there's a state interest to make sure that its citizens can earn a living?
You know, one of the places it talks about is in Brown v. Board of Education. There, you know, desegregation, one of the reasons it describes education is so important is because of the vital role it plays in terms of economic self-sufficiency. I think that may be actually the first place that you get an articulation of it. And over the years, there have been other cases that have reiterated this point.
So the first state interest is economic self-sufficiency.
Economic self-sufficiency. And so then you have to ask yourself, well, okay, we got it. You need to make sure everyone's economically self-sufficient. And then you should look at all the rules and all the requirements that the state has and ask yourself, do these advance economic self-sufficiency? Or, and maybe I'll use language from like some New York cases, is this the least intrusive way to make sure every kid is economically self-sufficient? Which means like this is something really important and you should try to infringe on the parent's 14th Amendment right as little as possible.
Fair.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. We call this strict scrutiny. That's the basic idea over here.
Because there's this other interest that parents have this autonomy to raise their kids as they want versus this state interest of making sure that people are economically self-sufficient. Let's override that parent's interest as little as possible. That's strict scrutiny.
Yeah, that's right. What's the least restrictive way to get to this compelling government interest or least intrusive way to make sure this happens? That's one. The other one that comes up a lot in Supreme Court opinions is also making sure that citizens are prepared to be civically engaged.
Civically engaged.
The idea of like they should be informed enough to be able to study the issues and vote, even to serve in the armed forces. I think that's also in Brown v. Board of Education, the reference to the armed forces. Ways in which we play roles as citizens.
To be involved in our country.
All the things that we need to be able to do. Those are like the two like core, at least to my mind, compelling government interests, why the government needs to be able to have certain educational standards. And again, they should be as least intrusive as possible.
Strict scrutiny.
Strict scrutiny. That's the idea over here. And so to me, that's the question. I mean, if you want to look at this case and ask yourself, like, how should this work legally? You should ask yourself, like, is the set of rules that New York State has currently, are they necessary in order to accomplish these two objectives?
Number one, are they tailored to make sure that the products of these schools are going to be economically self-sufficient? The requirements are geared toward that. And number two, that they're articulated within this lens of strict scrutiny, that they're not just willy-nilly, my favorite adjective from Rabbi Soloveitchik, overriding this 14th Amendment, which remains in place.
Economic self-sufficiency, civic engagement, and are they necessary to accomplish those goals? And you know, here you'd want to just sit down with the list and see what you think. I probably have views that things like math, science, English, history, those are probably necessary for economic self-sufficiency and civic engagement. We could possibly fight about the details, like, do I need to know? You know, you can see how this might go.
Correct. It gets very nitty-gritty where you're parsing through every requirement, which is coming on the state level, to make sure that it is in line with these compelling state interests, civic engagement, economic self-sufficiency, and has that real strict scrutiny to make sure that they're not undermining that 14th Amendment. I'm curious for you, in the seat that you are, because you are engaged with many of the advocates involved in this issue, why do you think this has provoked such engagement and intensity on both sides of this issue?
The stakes are super high.
What are the stakes here?
You know, on the one hand, I think it's long been true that the capacity to provide a religious education, a robust religious education, one that is deep and long, that you get in a lot of Orthodox communities, is essential, vital to the way of life of Orthodox Jews. And certainly certain Hasidic communities, and that without it, the likelihood that these communities would be able to pass their tradition on to the next generation is in danger. What could be more important to a parent? I feel this all the time. Like, you want to pass this down to your children. And
this is why we're here.
Yeah. And if somebody threatens that, they're threatening everything, right? Now everything's in danger. On the flip side, you have people who leave these communities and have pressed their claims hard and said, listen, we get what our parents, what they wanted to do, but like from their perspective, this isn't about you. We have a right to get trained and prepared to be economically self-sufficient and civically engaged. You know, we want to be part of the American story also. And like, if we can't make a buck and we can't figure out, you know, what we think about questions of voting and other important issues. So, you know, you're taking something away from us that we're entitled to as Americans, and you shouldn't be able to make that choice for us. These are ways weighty issues.
Do you remain optimistic for the law's capacity to navigate these two competing concerns?
Oh, God. I like to be optimistic generally about the law. I worry when the temperature gets very high. It's very hard to, kind of walk in and say, hey, we get the idea. Can we kind of go through this list and see what you really need? Mm-hmm. That gets hard to do. And certainly when you put politics into it,
This inevitably, over here, you'd admit, does involve politics.
A lot of politics. I mean, a lot of the requirements, especially the ancillary requirements, they're enacted by a legislature. As we said at the outset, like different groups that elect officials have different interests in what should be required. I'm going to give an example. Like, I have no issue with people wanting a particular requirement, but, there is a provision of the education law that says that if a school fails to teach about the Irish potato famine, it's held against them in evaluating whether or not they've provided an education that is substantially equivalent. That's the language that's in the statute 3204. Substantially equivalent to what's provided in public schools. That's what's required of private school education. The Irish potato famine is a big deal. 1 million people died. Like, it's a major issue in European history, and I think it's essential that every child should learn it. Do I want to say I'm going to close down a school that fails to teach about the Irish potato famine?
Does it rise to the level of strict scrutiny where we need to enforce this in every single school? And that's where you really have these competing interests sitting down and parsing through these laws one by one, making sure that they rise to that level.
Yeah, it's very important to a particular community whose history is captured in the Irish potato famine. And so you understand why people advocated for this provision in the education law.
It would almost be the equivalent, and you never like making comparisons about the Jewish community and the Holocaust.
Well, in fact, the Holocaust is in the same provision of the education law. There are 3 in there: Irish potato famine, Holocaust, slavery.
So before we start poo-pooing the...
Oh, yeah. So if you're with me on Irish potato famine, what do you think about the Holocaust? This gets super touchy.
Yeah.
And you have a legislature with constituents trying to figure out what you're going to put on the list. You can see how, this is hard. It's hard to educate, to build a curriculum based on politics. And you can see how that might lend itself over time, even if not today, but in the future, lend itself to bureaucratic overreach in ways that might be concerning.
If our statewide curriculums are the product of legislators who are beholden to their constituents, then let's say it changes. Let's say they add things that are clearly in violation, clearly beyond the rules of strict scrutiny. You can end up with requirements that are really undermining potentially the 14th Amendment in the future.
Yeah, certainly in the future.
Even if now this list, you don't see anything egregious, there are concerns about the future.
Yeah, so if somebody handed me a pen and said, fix this, I would say, yeah, let's sit down and really think deeply about what is necessary to make sure that every child in the state of New York gets an education where they're economically self-sufficient and they have the capacity for civic engagement. I think that's super important. I personally think we, as citizens, as government, have an obligation to make that happen. And then let's try to figure out how to do it. The process, the legal process, litigation, combined with jockeying within a legislature, I'm not sure I'm optimistic about our likelihood of getting there in a way that's got the right fit.
And remaining faithful to the underlying government interests that require it, and not eventually undermining that principle of the 14th Amendment that allows parents to have that. Meaning it could, without the proper provisions and guardrails, so to speak, it could eventually undermine a lot of people's interests.
Yeah, I have reasons to be nervous now. I have even bigger reasons to be nervous in the future. And yet at the same time, I don't want to give up on those two, what I think are compelling government interests. I would take it to be a real problem if the government gave up on its obligation, which I believe it has the authority to enforce, its obligation to make sure every child could be economically self-sufficient and civically engaged. This is tough. You talk about trying to be in the middle on some of this stuff, and what does it mean to be a centrist over here, especially in a legal environment where culture wars and all this stuff, just heat and noise. I feel like I'm this guy in the corner with a pen and a pad. I'm like, well, if you carry the three, if you can just did you see how it did the Pythagorean everything's fine. I really hope there's a way forward to make that possible, a way that we can really try to protect as much as possible about the capacity of parents to pass down their faith to the next generation, and at the same time remain committed to these two kind of underlying principles.
Well, there are certainly some schools that are doing it extraordinarily well. I think I am the product of one, and the fact that that possibility even exists, to me, gives great reason to be optimistic that there is a way to reconcile these two sometimes competing ideals.
Well, if you're going to be optimistic, I'll be optimistic. I'm fine with that.
I identify with you a lot on this because I feel like we sometimes find ourselves in environments among people who are, the word is not extremist, but are very partisan and passionate about certain issues. And I, by temperament and also by ideology, am somewhat of a centrist. I like understanding both sides of an issue. I sometimes very much get accused, usually pejoratively, like angrily, like you're both sidesing an issue. And my response is like, guilty as charged. I believe these issues have two sides. And it's very hard to get pigeonholed into one very specific corner when there's so much complexity around an issue.
Maybe you could be the both sides are in chief. Is that a thing?
The
Would
both
that work?
You'll be the educator in chief.
You'll be the both sides
and I'll
are
be
in
the
chief.
both sides.
We'll go on the road. It'll be great.
But you've been in such rooms where like you don't quite fully align. Politics thrives on slogans, on bite size, not simplicity in the sense that it's wrong, but something that could bite size and sway the masses. And I think where legal scholars thrive and where I feel most personally comfortable is with like a lot of like these nuancy distinctions that are very hard to sell to the masses. And it's very hard to build coalitions around because they're not as easy to explain. They're not as easy to transmit. And the fact that you're able to do that with the groups that you work with so admirably and with so much integrity is something I find quite moving and really an example for us all.
Well, thank you for the eulogy at the end. I think that was great. I'll say the people I find to be the best authors and best explainers are people who can convey the proportions of an issue.
What do you mean by that?
Like when I write something, I want to explain how right and how wrong something is. Nothing's ever like completely right or completely wrong,
I
but
love that.
like how much is this a 70-30 case or an 80-20 case? Like that's what I think I want to understand. Is this argument likely to win even though there is some merit to the other argument? And, you know, as you say, like a lot of writing, especially about culture war issues, a lot of it is like either this is completely right or that is completely right. And you could have a strong view. You could be an 80-20 person, right? Mm-hmm. But if you can't find a way, even in expressing your 80, how to give oxygen to the 20 to explain like what's going on, I think ultimately it flattens issues and people, and when I'm reading somebody, I don't understand enough to really feel like I'm engaged as to what's going on and how to differentiate.
Exactly. That's why I have trouble with a lot of media depictions of these culture wars. And that's why I gravitate towards, well, you don't write enough. I always push you to write more. No, but I gravitate to your articles because you do that. I didn't know what you meant at first. You give the proportions. You don't both sides it, but you kind of explain what are the issues driving each side. And I think most of these, there's a reason why it went to the Supreme Court. There's a reason why there's so many people fighting over these issues.
And it's real law. Like there's a real legal issue here. It's not just politics all the way down. And like, I may think it's 80-20, but at least if I describe the 20 enough to you, you may come back to me and say, listen, you're an idiot. That 20 is actually 60 or 70. And at least, you know, you've got the resources to say like why you think I'm wrong. And I should arm every person. I think everybody should arm every person when they're making an argument in favor of a particular legal or policy issue. You should arm your critics to understand why you might be wrong. Otherwise, you're flattening issues. You're engaged in pure advocacy. We all want to get smarter and make, you know, other people smarter. That's the goal.
Avi Helfand, I cannot thank you enough for your time. I always end my interviews with more rapid fire questions. If you'll indulge me for just one more moment, what is a book you would recommend for somebody who wants to better understand constitutional issues as they relate to religion, aside from the actual Constitution, but where religion and constitutional issues butt heads, how they're resolved, how they are navigated? Could be a textbook, hopefully not one that's too expensive, but what book would you recommend on this topic?
I'll tell you, I want to give you one that talks about actually like church and state for American Jews. Is that okay, given the nature of our conversation? A book by Greg Ivers called To Build a Wall, where he talks about how it is that American Judaism engaged on these issues when it came to church and state. It had a massive impact on how I think about these issues, just seeing his telling of the history of it to really understand like where we come from.
Greg Ivers, To Build a Wall. My next question, and we've had a lot of listeners say maybe we should switch up our questions because we have too many PhDs who have guessed. You did a PhD in a topic that every time you tell me, I forget almost instantaneously. It's that memorable.
I think you actually fall asleep in the middle of my telling you the title. Yeah.
What was the title of your...
I'm not going to do it again. Not happening.
But if somebody gave you a great deal of money to go back to school and earn a second PhD, what do you think the subject and title of your dissertation would be? would be.
Can I go for something else?
Absolutely.
I'm changing. I want an MBA.
Do you really?
Yeah.
You want an MBA?
Yeah.
Why? I'm just so curious.
I'm increasingly interested in how our institutions work and function, like the operations of it.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, like questions of how we make our institutions better, I think there's a lot of issues that maybe an MBA could help with. Is that so terrible?
No, I love that. My final question, I'm always curious about people's sleep patterns. What time do you wake up in the morning and what time do you go to sleep at night?
I have no pattern.
You have no pattern.
Absolutely not.
You're a life in chaos like myself.
I'm a complete life in chaos. I mean, this semester, I'm like commuting back and forth to Yale to teach. So like, I don't even know where the hell I am most of the time. I don't know what time zone it is. I thought we were doing this podcast 3 hours earlier because
Correct.
I had it the wrong time in my
You texted
calendar.
me early. You texted me in the middle of the afternoon saying, I'm going to be late. I'm busy from 5:30 to 7:30. I said, we're scheduled for 8:30. And you said, I have this in my calendar for 5:30.
Pacific time.
Pacific
yeah,
time.
I didn't
Why
realize.
not?
Yeah, who knew? Okay.
Avi Helfand, thank you so much for your time today.
David, great hanging out as always.
There is a fantastic book that I want to recommend for those who really are fascinated with how religion and state issues have really shaped the American Jewish community. It is a book called Religion and State in the American Jewish Experience. Pretty self-explanatory title. It is written by both Jonathan Sarna and David Dallin. And it's a fantastic history of the battles to find equal footing in America. And I think this is still playing out when it comes to the role of education, how education as an issue has really shaped the community itself. This goes back to the very founding of the United States. There is a famous letter that sits, actually, if you ever visit the office of the president of Yeshiva University, President Ari Berman, right outside of his office, there is a letter that was written in 1818 by Thomas Jefferson to Mordechai Manuel Noah. It's actually owned by Yeshiva University, by the museum, and in that letter, Thomas Jefferson writes to Mordechai Manuel Noah of the key to finding equal footing in our community is robust educational institutions. When people see Jews and the Jewish community educating their kids, growing up in a way with a substantive education, both secular and religious, he's talking about achievements in the sciences and the math, it's going to change not just the landscape of the Jewish community, but the entire American Jewish experience. And this is almost the founding struggle of not just the Jewish community, but the American project itself. And in any struggle, it can be easy to become disappointed and disillusioned that we're not all the way there, that the toll and the cost of education weighs on so many families. And there is a letter that is quite moving. It was written by Rav Yitzchak Hutner, who was the Rosh Yeshiva in Chaim, Berlin, and he wrote it to Rav Moshe Scherer. He was the head of Agudas Yisrael and really led the early charge for advocacy on the government level to ensure that the Jewish community was being looked at properly with equality, with equity by the United States government. And he suffered a really big loss in court over one of these battles related to Jewish education and funding. And Rav Hutner sent him a very beautiful letter in the aftermath. And this is written in the biography of Rav Moshe Scherer, which is a fascinating lens to kind of some of the legal battles and advocacy in general that was published by ArtScroll and written by Yonason Rosenblum, another former 1840 guest. And this is what Rav Hutner wrote to Rabbi Scherer, and I find it so moving, and I'd like to share it with you now. It's a little bit of Yiddish. Don't worry, I promise you I will translate it. After this disappointing loss in court, Nish Bais my Yiddish is atrocious, so please, hold your laughter. But Rav Hutner wrote him that there are 3 rules when it comes to working on behalf of the general Jewish community. Nish Bais Verin, Nish Farmateren Verin, und Nish Velen Oisvereren. It's terrible Yiddish. I'm sorry. My apologies that you even had to listen to that, but it's very moving what he said. If you work on behalf of the Jewish community, don't get angry, don't get tired, and don't be obsessed with prevailing. That Rav Hutner pointed out that Avraham, when he sacrificed his son Yitzchak at the Akedah, it did not detract one iota from the merit that accrued to him, the fact that he didn't actually go through with it. He was stopped at the altar. But Akedah's Yitzchak, that sacrifice, is known as the sacrifice that has shaped the Jewish community through the generations, Knesset Yisroel. And Rav Hutner said, a mensch darf tun, nicht oiftun. We are commanded to do, not to accomplish. And I think part of that is that, look, we don't have the ability to have the transformation to make it easier on families that we hope for. We're going to keep on working towards this. But with the understanding that as a community, We can't get angry, we can't get tired, and we can't be obsessed with prevailing. We have to understand that so long as we're headed in the right direction with the sensitivities and commitments for Jewish education for all, knowing that this is the one reservoir that protects and preserves not just the continuity, but the engagement of the current generation, then God willing, we won't just be doing, but eventually we will prevail as well. So thank you so much for listening. And once again, thank you so much to Ari and Daniela Schwartz for sponsoring this series in honor of Daniela's grandfather, Mr. Baruch Mappa, Baruch ben Asher Zelig Halevi. Thank you so much. This episode was edited by our dearest friend, Dina Emerson. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number is 917-720-5629. Once again, 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.